We have breaking news at this hour from the committees that are doing the impeachment investigation, who conducted the 9.5-hour deposition today with former State Department envoy Kurt Volker. The committee chairmen have released a joint statement saying that today's hearing and the documents obtained in the hearing, especially the text messages obtained in the hearing, have been very revealing. They say these text messages reflect serious concerns raised by a State Department official about the detrimental effects of withholding critical military assistance from Ukraine and the importance of setting up a meeting between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian president without further delay. We quoted you one of those texts that had already leaked earlier in this hour. That was from Bill Taylor. That was Bill Taylor saying in a text, "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." This document, released tonight by the chairs of the committees, now provides the full context and the full exchange on that text. Also has a text from Bill Taylor to others involved in the discussions about Ukraine. Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigation? That was a text to Gordon Sondland, whose response was, "Call me." That is a recurring response from Gordon Sondland. We've seen in these texts that whenever Bill Taylor goes into the essence of what the Trump administration is up to, linking aid to a criminal investigation of Joe Biden, Gordon Sondland always wants to take that off of a written record and move it on to a verbal phone call. We are joined now by phone by Congressman Eric Swalwell, who was in some of that or most of that or even all of that deposition today, who knew about this information, has been unable to comment on it in his previous comments until it's been released by the committee chairs. Congressman Swalwell, what else can you tell us about this information that's now being released?
Good evening, Lawrence. I was present for the whole interview with the ambassador, and first, he corroborated entirely what the whistleblower complaint stated, that there was a shakedown, a shadow shakedown going on by Rudy Giuliani. It looks like ordered by President Trump, and as the whistleblower said, he was told that there was an effort to have the Ukrainians, quote unquote, play ball. And so here's what the Ukrainians understood as soon as President Zelensky was sworn into office, that there were two asks from the White House, and that if he wanted a meeting with President Trump, he had to, one, investigate the 2016 election and essentially exonerate Russia, and two, investigate the Bidens. And that ask was made throughout the process of him being president up until that phone call and even beyond. We have evidence of State Department officials, particularly Bill Taylor, expressing concern even before he came on board to be the second in command in Ukraine of the role that Rudy Giuliani was playing. And just a couple weeks ago, Mr. Taylor said he thought it was crazy that security assistance would be tied to the president's political campaign.
There's a report tonight that Kurt Volker co-wrote a statement that they hoped the president of Ukraine would give, and he co-wrote that with Gordon Sondland. Was that part of his testimony today?
Well, I'm going to leave it, to the text messages that were released, but you do see in those text messages that there was a concerted effort. It looks like it was being led by the president, carried out by Rudy Giuliani, to make sure that the Ukrainians were expressing to President Trump that they would indeed investigate the 2016 election, as well as this upcoming 2020 election as it related to a potential 2020 appointee. So, again, that corroborates what the whistleblower says. That also really, I would say, corroborates the president's intent on that phone call, and it gives us new witnesses to interview as we go forward.
On this text from Bill Taylor to Gordon Sondland, where he says, "Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting," that means a White House meeting for the president of Ukraine, "are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations?" Gordon Sondland, his response is just "call me." Do we know what happened when Bill Taylor called him? Do we know what was said then?
No, we don't, and that's why we have, a new witness, a potential witness in Mr. Taylor. But again, when so much of this is taking place on WhatsApp, that's the forum that they are talking, and then it's moved off of that. Again, you can conclude, I believe, that it's because that Ambassador Sondland does not want to discuss, what the president's true intentions are, and you do see that, as you pointed out, a number of times. Mr. Taylor consistently, from the time he is placed in charge or is the second in command, and then there's no ambassador, and he's essentially the de facto ambassador, he has concerns about Rudy Giuliani's role. And then you see Ambassador Volker, who I would describe as, a serious ambassador who is running a parallel diplomacy effort, as Rudy Giuliani is truly the one who has the president's intentions. Ambassador Volker, I believe, was carrying out the intentions of the United States to deliver security assistance to Ukraine, while Rudy Giuliani was carrying out the ambitions and desires of President Trump, which was to benefit himself in an upcoming election.
Did Kurt Volker tell you today under oath why he resigned from the State Department last week?
He did, and I don't want to go into that. The transcript is going to be released soon, but we believe the text messages, really do speak for themselves. And, it is clear that a shadow shakedown was being run by Rudy Giuliani to benefit his client, not the office of the president, but Donald Trump, an individual who had a vested political interest in a 2020 outcome where he was leveraging U.S. tax dollars to his benefit.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate that.
You.
And John Heilman is back with us, and joining us at the table, David Frum, senior editor for The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for George W. Bush. Also with us, Norm Ornstein. He's a congressional historian, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And this table is stacked with text messages that you have all been studying as quickly as you can while the congressman's been talking. David, go ahead.
I don't think the serious nature of the conversation you just had does justice to the rich comedy of these text messages. I mean, this is like a high school musical about evil wrongdoers. I'm looking at one here from July 25th of 2019, a message from Kurt Volker. Good luck. Good lunch. Thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, quote, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow. So the visit to the White House, it's in a text message, is predicated on getting to the bottom of Trump's crazy fantasies.
So there's China in July in a text message. They're texting about China investigating the Bidens in July.
They're texting about getting the Ukrainians to endorse this insane theory that Trump has, that Seth Rich is the person who actually hacked the Democratic.
But I'm sorry, was that referring to President Z, or was that referring to President Zelensky?
Sorry, no, not
Z as in Zelensky. Okay,
not she as in.
Right.
And you go through them again and again, and it's, as I said, we are talking so gravely, and Congressman Swalwell does such a good job, was talking so seriously and with such respect for the institutions, and then you read this, and it is a high school musical.
Well, Norm, this is one of the challenges when we're covering the game that couldn't shoot straight. But when they're trying to destroy the world, when they're basically shooting against the freedom protesters in Hong Kong, when they're shooting against Ukraine trying to maintain its independence from Russia, in effect. I mean, that's what this crazy gang that isn't shooting straight is firing bullets around. So keeping a straight face when we start reading their stuff isn't that easy.
I threw up a little in my mouth as I read some of this stuff. I will tell you, Lawrence, I've been here for 50 years.
You don't look it.
I know. I came at a very young age. I have never seen a level and depth of corruption, traitorous behavior that we have here, and the complicity all across the board. What I find striking about some of these texts is Bill Taylor trying to do the right thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And Gordon Sondland, any time that something comes up that seems a little fishy, says, let's stop texting, call me. Now, what does that mean? It means I'm not going to put on a text that's going to be released somewhere.
It's kind of late. Please delete this evil confession.
But, the lying here, but the idea that Donald Trump cares about corruption when He cuddles up to Sisi, to MBS in Saudi Arabia, to every vicious, corrupt dictator in the world. And this is the place where he cares about corruption? Please.
Well, John Heilman, wanting more of it.
What's your favorite?
Well, it's not one particular thing, but I will say that I'm really struck by the use of exclamation points throughout. There's a kind of a high schoolish quality to go to David's point. There's a lot of, and you see it particularly in the way Volker has communicated with Giuliani, where Giuliani has been citing these things, saying, well, Volker was like really, he was on my side, he was trying to help me out here. And there's a lot of, hi, Mr. Mayor, exclamation point. Thank you, exclamation point. The way you kind of, it's like you can sense that he's kind of treating Giuliani like he understands that he's a crazy person and that he has to be handled with kid gloves, but he's trying to kind of, be solicitous towards him, but also kind of the way a 15-year-old is solicitous with someone who they recognize as kind of a hot potato.
But this makes so clear why Mike Pompeo is blocking the testimony of everyone else that they want to hear from.
And lied about his own being on the phone call.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah.
There may be 25 people in Washington who cared about Ukraine before all this, but those 25 really cared about it and saw Ukraine's transition to greater success as the crucial work on the European continent for the democratization and liberalization in their time. And the idea that these 25 people, and Kurt Volker is one of them, who care so much about this project, 50 million people. And in the month of September, by the way, 50 Ukrainian soldiers, when the arms were delayed, 50 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded. This is not abstract. These are lives that are being sacrificed by President Trump's campaign. And these people have to deal with, as you say, the likes of Rudy Giuliani.
And Zelensky is so wounded by this that now he is being pushed to capitulate in the invasion of Crimea and legitimize it. And we shouldn't forget Mike Pence in all of this before we end. Greg Sargent has a timeline there. The idea that Pence didn't know any of this that was going on when it was being shouted from the rooftops by Giuliani and we had all this other stuff going on is ludicrous, too.
Well, I mean, and John, surely as we get more and more of this from inside the State Department, Mike Pence's name is going to be in these things at some point.
Well, yes, and it's clear that Pence is being dragged deeper and deeper into this, and he's being dragged in deeper and deeper both by the facts, by the fact that he is clearly more involved and more implicated than he would like to be or than anyone would like him to be, except for one person, Donald Trump, who part of the reason Pence is going to end up deeper and deeper in this is that Trump wants Mike Pence deeper and deeper into this, because if it gets to a Senate trial, what Donald Trump wants to say to Senate Republicans is, hey, you get rid of me, this guy's just as dirty as I am.
And Norm, one of the 24 people who David was referring to who has always professed concern about Ukraine is Lindsey Graham. And we now know he didn't mean a word of it. Right. And as far as we can tell, he's never meant a word of anything he's ever said before Donald Trump became president.
I believe that if John McCain were alive today, that he would be shattered at the duplicity and complicity and traitorous behavior by Lindsey Graham. It's shocking.
We're going to have to leave it there. John Heilman, Norm Ornstein, David Frum, thank you for your speed reading of the text messages. Appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.